Hello everyone, I'm Kaushal and I'm with Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan today. Today we'll be discussing the recent events in Syria where President Bashar al-Assad was removed from power. Namaste sir.
Namaste, Kaushal.
The Syrian civil war began in 2011 in the backdrop of the Arab Spring and has remained frozen until recently. But the Syrian rebels have captured the entire country in a matter of weeks. So what might be the reasons of the rapid advance of the Syrian rebels?
In a matter of days, Kaushal.
In a matter of
It
days.
didn't take weeks also. Obviously, in the short term, if you take the events of the last year or so, several things happened very quickly and the law of unintended consequences has taken over. What were the Syria's basis for survival? Assad regime's survival. While there were many forces within Syria, from the more democratically inclined, more liberal Kurds, to the extreme jihadist elements like earlier ISIS, al-Qaeda, al-Nusra and others, to the democratic forces within the Arab world outside of Kurds. There are all kinds of colors and shades. But they were all resisted and Assad could survive largely because of three factors. One, the Russian support, very strong Russian support. Whenever required, they bombed the opponents, they gave weapons, they gave political cover in the United Nations and elsewhere. Sometimes they even sent troops and mercenaries. Two, the Iranian support, weapons, money. Most of all, the Hezbollah, which was in the neighboring area, gave physical support, logistical support, troop support, weapon support, and so on and so forth. The third, Israel had some kind of a truce. They came to the conclusion, apparently, that status quo in Syria would serve their interests okay. Because you don't know if Syrian government falls, however authoritarian Assad is, if a jihadi government comes, we have seen ISIS. ISIS took roots in Syria. Essentially, it is about the instability in Syria and Iraq that led to ISIS. And of course, al-Qaeda is predecessor form. And that's obviously far more dangerous. So Israel was somewhat neutral. Now, last 1 year, post-October 7th massacre by the Hamas group in Israel, all this has changed. Not only is Hamas largely destroyed, Hezbollah has been largely neutralized, particularly in the last few weeks. So therefore, suddenly support from Iran and Hezbollah has disappeared. The second is Soviet Union or Russia has been preoccupied with its own war of aggression in Ukraine. But they were depending on weapons and some missiles and drones from countries like Iran and North Korea, which is shocking that Russia would depend on North Korea and Iran, both facing extreme sanctions. Both are very obscurantist countries with very little relations with the rest of the world, particularly North Korea. It's actually a commentary on our times. Therefore, Russian support suddenly disappeared. They didn't know how to deploy resources or troops or even air force to help Syrian regime, Assad regime. Israel, I think, continues to be somewhat neutral, but probably, we don't know yet, probably certain intelligence agencies in some of the Western countries and others came to the conclusion that the fall of Syrian regime, Assad regime, is in their interest in the long term. Therefore, there's always a fear that Israel would attack any time. They could take over anything. For instance, Golan Heights, the area which is now buffer zone. Golan Heights was the Syrian territory occupied by Israel in 1967, annexed in 1974. But there's a buffer zone by global agreement, international agreement. But now Israel within hours could take it over. And tomorrow, if some more southern Syria parts are taken over by Israel, nobody can stop it. So a combination of circumstances tactically made it impossible for Assad to survive. But this is the proximate situation. But there's a long-term issue. In 2011, 2012, as you said, at the height of Arab Spring, when there were protests in Syria, if only Assad regime had the wisdom to negotiate with these forces and bring about a peaceful democratic transition, even if it's not a full-fledged democracy as we understand, but some kind of a semi-democratic regime, from an authoritarian regime to semi-authoritarian regime, enhanced legitimacy, it would have been wonderful for that country and for those people, and perhaps even for that regime. And look at Assad. Assad is the son of a dictator. He is a medical doctor, an ophthalmologist, well-trained. And hopefully a medical doctor, well-trained in saving lives and alleviating suffering, is a humanist. And yet, the impulses of the regime being what they are, he became a thoroughgoing autocrat, one of the most notorious dictators in modern era. And instead of negotiating with the people in a very complex and diverse country with diverse interests and figuring out a means of peace, stability, and some degree of freedom and growth, he depended on a repressive regime. And that paid way to all this. That caused enormous strife to the rest of the world. Whether ISIS, other jihadist groups right now, the fear that all of us harbor is, Assad was of course a thoroughgoing dictator. Nobody should shed a tear about him. But can we be certain that the fellows who succeed him are going to bring peace and stability to Syria? And from our point of view, from the rest of the world, can we be sure that there will not be jihadist forces unleashed? So the world is somewhat on tenterhooks. We'll have to wait and see.
So moving on from your statement about the jihadist forces in Syria, one of the major leaders of the civil war, Muhammad al-Julani, he was a part of al-Qaeda until 2016. And he's also appeared on various hit lists released by the US government. So what might be the regional or global implications of such a leader coming to power in Syria, despite his attempts at showcasing himself as a reformist?
Absolutely. He's all of 40 years old. He was born in 1982, I understand, so 41 years old. And in the past 10, 12 years, he has seen many avatars. He was also with the ISIS affiliate initially. Later al-Qaeda fighting ISIS. Now a proto-democratic force alleged to be, appearing to be. So there's some kind of a makeover of that man. And America is very confused because there's still a $10 million bounty on his head. So it shows what happens when a country is in turmoil. That's why many people in India and elsewhere who talk about self-determination, they don't realize that as long as there's reasonable stability and peace and some negotiation across the diverse groups in the society, breaking up is not an option at all, because breaking up leads to greater violence, chaos, disorder, and pain and suffering. Erstwhile Yugoslavia, we see what happened. When it broke up, so much of pain in the fragmentation. Erstwhile Soviet Union, we are still feeling the reverberations of that. Much of what's happening in Ukraine or Belarus earlier or Georgia right now, Moldova earlier, all these are basically reverberations of the breakup of the Soviet Union. And Syria, while it's relatively small in size and population, is fairly diverse. And if people like al-Julani, whose real name appears to be Ahmad al-Shara, if they take over and if they are for the time being only showing one certain face to gain acceptability world over, but tomorrow if they show the real fangs, then the world will be in turmoil, apart from Syrian people being in trouble. Because what they do to their people will be horrific if they don't handle themselves well. But what they do to the rest of the world is going to be even more horrific from our point of view. We can't afford jihadist forces. In fact, much of the turmoil in the Western world today is linked to migration, largely fueled by Syrian civil war in Afghanistan and instability in Iraq and other regions, therefore vast migration to Europe and the resistance of the people on the one hand, and the rise of the jihadi cult and therefore random acts of terror all over the Western world and the rest of the world, and therefore the panic, fear and hatred that is stimulated. So we can't afford another round of that. The world economically is much more insecure, politically is much more unstable, and socially is less cohesive. And if you now allow jihadist forces to rise in whatever form, in whatever guise, and in a very important area of Syria, it will be very detrimental to the world. So we must watch very carefully. And how the world is going to handle that, we don't know. Ultimately, Syrian people must find the strength and resources and the willingness to sacrifice. And the elites must forge a consensus. But just a word about Syria's importance. Just remember, agricultural revolution came about 10 to 12,000 years ago. Where did it come from? Today's Syria and Iraq. It is that what we call that Islamic crescent. That is the cradle of civilization. Because from there to Asia, through Europe, Asia against Central Asia, as well as South and Southeast Asia, two migrations took place from Africa, and then to Europe. So all the civilization as we understood in the past 10, 12,000 years, it came from the Tigris-Euphrates belt of Iraq and that Syria, Levant as we call it now. So it always has been an incredibly important place. It is the connecting link along with Lebanon and Israel to Mediterranean to Asia. And without Syria being in a good shape, the impact of Syrian instability and jihadi cult or violence, it will be not limited to Syrian territory. It will be exported to much of the rest of the world, to North Africa, to Asia. Particularly, we are concerned in South Asia because we have seen for years the price of terror, Europe, and to some extent America, though it's isolated by a continent, it's ultimately a pond, Atlantic. Therefore, America obviously is not isolated. Afghan problems spilled out America and created the 9/11. So I think this is a moment when the world should pause. And I hope the great powers will act with some degree of restraint rather than act in a conspiratorial manner in pursuit of what they believe is their interest without regarding the long-term consequences.
So, coming back to the foreign intervention in Syria, the Assad regime was backed by Russia and Iran, especially since the Syrian civil war began. There's also been an emergent so-called axis of resistance. So, do the events in Syria over the past couple of days, do they weaken Russia and Iran's presence and also the axis of resistance in the region overall?
Certainly, for the time being, their tactical ability to make an impact extraterritorially is diminished because Russia is now preoccupied with Ukraine. While Ukraine is suffering and ultimately Ukraine is the loser, Russia did not gain either. The Russian people lost hundreds of thousands of troops, loss of life or casualties in terms of serious injuries. Their economy has suffered. While they recovered for some time, again, the inflation is very high. Economy is now finding strains, except that they are suffering less than Ukraine. Russia is not a winner in this ultimately. And Iran, certainly with the loss of Hezbollah and now Syria, their largest strategy of somehow finding a leverage, even as they messed up their society with the extreme Islamic kind of a Sharia rule, Iran is now in quandary. It does. But nations like Russia and Iran, Russia has a population which is bigger than any other European country, about 14, 15 crore. Russia has a territory which is about 9 million square kilometers. And it has vast natural resources. And therefore, while they may be, and it of course has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. So Russia cannot be down forever. There may be some setbacks. So we have to find a negotiated agreement with Russia as to what their sphere of influence is and where the sphere of influence of the rest remain. If America, for instance, had something like a Marshall Plan after 1989, 1991 with Russia and allowed Russia to be integrated with the global society, it would have been better. But that's only post-mortem now. We can't undo the past. So we have to find some kind of a negotiated resolution. Similarly, Iran has a population of more than 80 million, almost 90 million population. And Iran is a very civilized country. Remember, Iran has civilization from Darius. Alexander the Great defeated Darius, the Emperor Darius in Persian Empire. So from then onwards, there is a sense of cohesion and civilization. So they cannot be destroyed. Again, Iranian regime, the people of Iran must decide what is it that they want. They are suffering quite considerably. We have seen young women being attacked brutally just because the headdress is not properly covering the hair or something like that. And I'm sure many Iranians are very deeply upset about it. And the global community also must see what best they can do to help Iranian people. Destruction is not an option. Neither Iran nor Russia will disappear. But they have to change their ways. So the rest of the world also must help them change their ways instead of viewing the world in black and white.
On that note, thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.